That wooden bridge, the lifeline tying my resort to the world, didn't just fall, it was murdered. Planks bobbed in the creek like scattered puzzle pieces, and the hand-carved sign I'd poured weeks into crafting lay split in half, drifting downstream like it had given up. This wasn't a storm's doing or old wood giving out. This was a calculated hit. The culprit, an HOA with more theatrics than a soap opera and zero respect for property lines. I'm Carter, and I've learned the hard way that some folks wield neighborhood standards like a weapon. Let me take you back to how this mess started. 3 years ago, I was a burned-out tech project manager in Denver, drowning in endless meetings and a barrage of pinging notifications that haunted my sleep. I scraped by, eating ramen, cramming into a studio apartment that cost more than most mortgages, saving every dime for a dream bigger than a corner office. When I stumbled on 45 acres of untouched land in Willowbrook Springs, Colorado, priced like a downtown condo, I knew it was my chance to build a life that felt mine. The day I drove that first post into the dirt, I kissed it corny, sure, but it was my stake in something real. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment. Share with us if you have any confrontation with the HOA wheel. Narrate your story on our channel. Sounds stupid, but it felt like anchoring my soul to the land that wilderness would be mine to honor with sweat splinters and stubborn hope. First post became the corner of what would later be my main cabin, and every time I walked past it during construction, I remembered the moment. I chose hope over fear. The previous owner had built a solid wooden bridge 15 years earlier that crossed Willowbrook Creek, the only access point to the property. That bridge had been inspected annually by county engineers and was completely safe-rated for vehicles up to 10,000 pounds. It was rustic, sure, but it perfectly matched the vibe I was going for. I spent the next 18 months teaching myself construction from YouTube videos and library books, pouring concrete footings in freezing Colorado winters, framing walls with lumber I'd mill myself, and handcrafting furniture from local timber during long nights when I couldn't sleep from excitement about what I was building. 6 luxury cabins emerged from that raw land, each one designed specifically for executives and tech workers who needed to escape the digital noise that was slowly driving them insane. I carved that resort sign myself during the second winter, spending weeks sanding every letter until it was perfect, treating the wood with oils I'd researched 4 months to ensure it would last decades. The business model was simple but effective: digital detox retreats for people exactly like state used to be. No Wi-Fi in the cabins, no cell towers within 10 meters, just peace and the sound of Willowbrook Creek flowing under that old wooden bridge. After 18 months of operation, I was actually profitable, something that shocked every business advisor I'd consulted during the planning phase. 85% booking rate throughout the year, 5-star reviews across every platform, and a growing wait list of repeat customers who'd found exactly what they were looking for in my little slice of paradise. Executives would arrive stressed and burned out, checking their phones obsessively during the first day, then gradually relaxing into a rhythm of hiking, reading actual physical books, and remembering what silence sounded like without the constant hum of electronics. They'd leave refreshed and grateful, many booking their next stay before they even checked out, telling me I'd saved their sanity and sometimes their marriages. The guests weren't just customers, they were people rediscovering themselves, I remember. One executive from a major tech company who arrived so stressed he couldn't stop his hands from shaking. By day 3, he was chopping firewood for the simple pleasure of physical work. By day 7, he was planning to restructure his entire company to prioritize employee well-being. These transformations happened regularly, and watching people rediscover their humanity made every 18-hour construction day worthwhile then. Beverly Ashford moved in 6 months ago. She bought a $750 zero house in the residential area that shared the main access road with my resort, a pristine white colonial that looked like it belonged in a luxury home magazine rather than rural Colorado. Within the first week, I received a formal complaint letter about commercial vehicles disrupting the residential character of our community. The letter was typed on expensive letterhead and delivered by certified mail as if she were serving legal papers instead of voicing a neighbor complaint. I was genuinely confused because my resort was completely legal, classified as rural hospitality business, with all proper permits and zoning approvals that had been granted years before. Bev even knew Willowbrook Springs existed. The county planning department had signed off on everything. The fire department had approved my access roads, and the health department had certified my water and waste systems. I dotted every I and crossed every T during the permitting process specifically to avoid conflicts with future neighbors. But that first letter should have been my warning that this wasn't about legality or zoning compliance. Bev made it clear from day 1 that she'd moved to Willowbrook Springs to create what she called the perfect high-end residential community. She'd been an interior designer for luxury homes in Aspen before moving here, and she had very specific ideas about what belonged in her neighborhood. Commercial vehicles, even the occasional rideshare, bringing guests to my resort, apparently didn't fit her vision of perfection. Looking back now, I realize that letter wasn't a complaint about legitimate concerns. It was a declaration of war against my very existence. You'd think removing my sin would calm things down, right? I thought so too, and that was my biggest mistake ever. Removing the sign didn't satisfy Bev. It showed her I could be intimidated, and that just made her push harder, like a predator sensing weakness in wounded prey. Within 2 weeks of that first letter, she escalated to what she called a cease and desist notice, claiming I was violating residential zoning covenants that apparently superseded my legal permits. The letter was full of official-sounding language about commercial operations incompatible with residential zoning and aesthetic disruption of community character. But when I researched every single claim with a fine-tooth comb, I found my resort was completely legal. My property wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. I'd specifically chosen land outside any homeowners association when I bought it, having heard enough horror stories about HOA overreach to avoid that particular nightmare. But Bev wasn't deterred by little things like facts, property law, or constitutional rights. She organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss community safety concerns, somehow convincing 60% of the local residents to establish a brand new HOA with her as president. I wasn't invited to this meeting. Of course, I found out about it when Nathan Brooks, who owns the local hardware store, stopped by the next morning to warn me about what was coming down the pipeline. Nathan had lived in Willowbrook Springs for 8 years, long before arrived with her grand plans for community transformation, and he'd already experienced her particular brand of aesthetic improvement. She'd forced him to repaint his store 3 times to match what she called the approved community palette, each time requiring him to close for business, while contractors applied whatever color scheme matched her current vision. He showed me his impressive collection of old store signs from dead Colorado towns, a hobby that reminded him how communities could survive and thrive or wither and die based on how they treated local businesses. That woman's idea of perfection is everybody else's nightmare, he told me, while helping me temporarily remove my resort sign from the roadside. She tried to get the county to shut me down last year, claim my delivery trucks were a safety hazard. The woman actually measured the width of my loading zone with a tape measure to see if she could claim a zoning violation. When that didn't work, she filed noise complaints about my power tools. During normal business hours, Nathan's experience was a preview of what Bev was capable of when someone stood between her and her vision of controlled perfection. Mrs. Langston, who once bought herbs from my garden stand every weekend, now crossed the road to avoid waving at me when I finally cornered her at the post office. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. It's nothing personal, Carter, she said, unable to meet my eyes, but I just want peace around here. Maybe if you could find some way to compromise with Beverly, we could all get along better. The community was already choosing sides, and Bev's campaign was working exactly as the new HOA immediately passed vague, suffocating aesthetic rules, clearly meant to choke my business limits on signage, vehicles, even tool usage, death by bylaws. She wore white gloves during these inspections, like the queen of a suburban dollhouse, checking for dust that might mar her perfect world. Bev live-streamed these HOA meetings like she was running for Congress, professionally produced with multiple camera angles and real-time chat moderation, cutting off anyone who tried to object to her increasingly authoritarian rules. But the real eye-opener was watching Bev in action around the neighborhood. During her daily community inspections, I witnessed her standing in front of a neighbor's house with an actual color palette, the kind interior designers use for million-dollar renovations, demanding they repaint because their chosen shade didn't match the community tone. Wasn't about property values or legitimate safety concerns. This was about one person's obsession with controlling every detail of everyone else's life to match her personal aesthetic preferences. I discovered she'd even created a neighborhood patrol schedule, recruiting residents to report violations of her aesthetic guidelines. She had a phone tree for organizing complaint campaigns and a shared document where neighbors could report concerning activities in real time. The level of surveillance and control she'd established in 6 months was honestly impressive in its thoroughness and terrifying in its implications for anyone who didn't conform to her standards. My tactical decision to remove my resort sign temporarily wasn't surrender, it was strategy. I didn't want to give Bev more ammunition by leaving up a sign she could film from multiple angles and use in professional complaint videos to county officials. But the neighborhood interpreted my action differently. Some thought I was giving up and preparing to sell. Others whispered that maybe Bev had a point about commercial operations not belonging in a residential area. What they didn't understand was that I was buying time to research my legal position and plan my next Move carefully, Nathan became an unexpected ally during this period, sharing intelligence about Bev's plans and warning me when she was organizing complaint campaigns or planning surprise inspections. He'd survived her harassment campaign against his hardware store by being stubborn and patient, but he could see she was escalating her tactics with my resort in ways. He told me one afternoon while delivering supplies for my temporary repairs. I've never seen her this focused on eliminating someone. She talks about your resort like it's a personal insult to her existence. What I didn't realize was that my sin removal had given Bev exactly the wrong message. Instead of seeing it as a gesture of good faith or temporary de-escalation, she interpreted it as proof that pressure tactics worked effectively if I could be intimidated into removing my sin. With just a few complaint letters, what else could she force me to change or eliminate entirely? That question would drive her next move, and it would be far more devastating than anything I'd imagined possible from a suburban homeowners association. President 4 days in Denver negotiating corporate retreat contracts with 3 major tech companies. That's all the time Bev needed to destroy 3 years of my life's work and nearly bankrupt my entire operation. I'd left the resort in the hands of my weekend staff, just like I'd done dozens of times before, without any problems. 12 guests were staying across the 6 cabins, enjoying their digital detox experience and participating in scheduled hiking excursions and mindfulness workshops. Everything was completely normal when I left Monday morning in my truck, looking forward to securing contracts that would ensure the resort's financial stability for the next upside down by what could only be described as a calculated act of sabotage. The wooden bridge that connected my resort to the outside world was completely gone. Not damaged by weather, not weakened by age, obliterated by professional demolition. Equipment: someone had brought in heavy machinery and reduced 15 years of solid construction to scattered debris. Cut with industrial equipment, and even the wooden railings had been systematically destroyed rather than simply removed. I didn't cry when, of my sign, the one with the W from Willowbrook, it still smelled like cedar oil, the same treatment I'd applied 3 years ago during those long winter nights when I carved each letter with my own hands, standing there in the cold water, holding that piece of my dreams. I felt something deeper than anger. I felt the death of innocence. These were executives and professionals. 200, but the real cost was watching terrified families being airlifted out while local news crews filmed everything from multiple angles. The story that aired that evening painted me as a negligent business owner who'd endangered his customers by operating over an unsafe bridge that had finally collapsed under the weight of commercial traffic. The first guest I ever greeted stood right where the bridge used to be. He looked up at my hand-carved sign and whispered, "This is what peace must look like." Now both the guest and the piece were gone, replaced by floating debris and the sound of helicopter rotors. I remembered that moment of pride when he booked a return visit before even unpacking. Same sense of sanctuary had been deliberately murdered. The reporter mentioned that county officials had received multiple reports about structural concerns from community safety advocates, but conveniently didn't mention who had filed those reports, or whether any actual engineering analysis had been conducted. The news segment included footage of my guest being evacuated, making it look like of perfect safety records and 5-star reviews was destroyed in a single news broadcast standing at the creek bank looking at the floating remains of my bridge while debris continued to drift. This wasn't just property damage, this was the deliberate destruction of everything I'd built with my own hands when I got back to my cabin. I saw the wooden lamp I'd hand-carved during my first winter here, sitting on the kitchen table where I'd left it in a moment of pure rage, the only time I completely lost control during this entire ordeal. I grabbed that lamp and smashed it against the wall you destroyed. 3 years of my life for aesthetics, I screamed at the empty room, knowing Bev couldn't hear me, but needing to say it anyway, to release the fury building in my chest. That's when Bev appeared at my door with crocodile tears and perfectly practiced sympathy. "I'm so sorry this terrible accident happened to your business," she said, managing to sound concerned while her eyes gleamed with barely concealed satisfaction. "Maybe I can help you find a qualified buyer for this property. With the bridge gone and the access issues, it might be better suited for private residential development rather than commercial operations." Sabotage was still floating past my windows. I hired an independent structural engineer to examine what remained of the bridge and provide a professional assessment of its condition before the demolition. His report was damning, not of the bridge's safety, but of whoever had ordered its destruction based on fabricated concerns. The bridge had been completely safe, showing no signs of structural weakness, metal fatigue, or wood deterioration. The support cables had been rated for loads. No legitimate reason for emergency demolition based on safety concerns. But emergency demolition was exactly what had happened while I was gone, authorized by County Inspector Richard Hayes, based on what he called credible engineering reports about imminent structural failure that posed immediate danger to public safety. When I requested copies of these reports, I was told they were preliminary assessments that hadn't been formally documented. Translation: Bev had pressured Hayes with fabricated concerns and he'd acted without proper investig. I paid $3.00 just to learn the truth. Revenue: I couldn't afford the legal fees. It was a perfect legal trap that would bankrupt me long before justice could be served. In my darkest moment that night, I actually called a real estate broker to discuss selling the property and cutting my losses before the situation got worse. But when he arrived the next morning and started talking about development potential for luxury retirement homes and maximizing land value by eliminating the commercial operation, something in me rebelled against the idea of surrender. This land, 18-hour workdays, and countless nights of planning and building. When the broker suggested that removing the commercial operation would make this prime residential real estate that could be subdivided into million-dollar lots, I told him to get off my property and never come back. That night, alone in my cabin with the broken pieces of my wooden lamps scattered across the floor I'd installed myself, I made a decision that would change everything. Legal victory might be possible eventually, but Bev thought she'd already won by destroying my bridge. What she didn't know was that I'd just discovered a secret weapon that could completely reverse our positions and turn her victory into her own defeat. Nathan showed up the next morning with coffee and his impressive collection of vintage store signs from Denton, Colorado towns, understanding instinctively that I needed perspective more than sympathy. As we sat on my handmade porch, looking at the destroyed bridge, he shared stories about communities that had survived and thrived, versus those that had died because they drove out local businesses that provided jobs and character. Every one of these signs, he said, pointing to a weathered Thompson's General Store sign from a Colorado ghost town, represents someone who fought to build something meaningful. Some won their battles, some lost, but they all fought instead of giving up when things got difficult. That conversation motivated me to dig deeper into my property records than I'd ever done before. I'd reviewed the basic deed and permits when I bought the land 3 years ago, but I'd never researched the full history of easements, access rights, and development agreements that governed how the surrounding residential area had been created. Nathan gave me an old survey map framed in his shop as a joke. He bought it at an estate sale because it showed the original layout of Willowbrook Springs from 1987. Thought, "You might like a piece of local history," he said with a grin. That's when I saw it, a dashed line cutting right through the center of my property. "Wait a minute," I said, studying the map more carefully. The main road that B's entire neighborhood used to access their properties actually ran across my land according to the original survey. I grabbed the current county maps and compared them. The road placement was identical, but the ownership details had somehow been obscured. In modern documentation, the dusty records confirmed what the map suggested. The road ran across my land, and an old clause gave me the right to end it. But that wasn't the best part. Then I found the signature page, the name on the original easement agreement, representing the real estate firm that had arranged the access rights, was Beverly M. Ashford. She had been a junior partner at the firm that created her own neighborhood's dependence on my property, and she'd apparently forgotten this crucial detail when she moved here and started her war against my resort. The irony was absolutely perfect. The woman trying to destroy my business had personally signed the document that gave me power over her entire community. I could legally terminate the road access easement with 30 days written notice to the affected property owners, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop me. 8 of the 10 houses in Bev's HOA would become completely landlocked without that road, as there was no alternate access route for the residential development. They were entirely dependent on crossing my property to reach their homes, and I had the legal right to revoke that permission at any time. B's $750. Zero house would lose 60% of its value overnight if it became inaccessible by car, dropping to maybe $300,000 for a landlocked property that could only be reached on foot. The property lawyer I consulted confirmed that my easement termination rights were absolute and legally bulletproof, backed by decades of Colorado property law and confirmed by multiple court precedent. Even better, Bev's own signature on the original agreement made any legal challenge impossible. She personally agreed to the termination clause 20 years ago. But here's the beautiful part that made this discovery even sweeter. I could build an alternate access route for my resort through the back portion of my property, connecting to a different public road that didn't cross anyone else's land. It would cost $15.00 and take 2 weeks of construction with heavy equipment, but it was completely feasible according to the topographical surveys. I would have permanent, independent access to my resort, while Bev's entire neighborhood would be cut off from the outside world unless they wanted to hike several miles through rough terrain to reach the nearest public road. Nathan offered to loan me construction equipment and help coordinate the road building project. Having accumulated an impressive collection of heavy machinery during his 8 years of running the hardware store. We spent that entire afternoon walking the proposed route, marking trees that would need clearing and identifying the easiest path for bulldozers and graders for the first time. Since seeing my destroyed bridge, I felt something other than despair and rage. I felt strategic excitement and the anticipation of complete reversal. The tables weren't just turning, they were completely flipping in a way that would give me all the power Bev had been wielding against me. The victim was about to become the person holding all the cards, and the aggressor was about to learn what helplessness felt like when someone else controlled access to her perfect world that evening. I sat alone in my cabin with the property documents spread across my handmade dining table, studying every detail of the easement agreements and termination procedures. I was cleaning up the broken pieces of my wooden lamp from the night before, and my hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline and anticipation, but I drove every nail back into place with determined precision. This wasn't just about fixing furniture. It was about rebuilding my resolve and preparing for the psychological warfare that was about to begin. As I worked, I thought about Bev's next move and her probable reactions to what was coming. She probably expected me to sell the property and disappear, leaving her perfect residential community free from commercial contamination forever. She'd destroyed my bridge, thinking it would destroy my business, never imagining that her own neighborhood's survival depended entirely on my goodwill and property rights. She didn't even know existed. The woman who'd spent months thinking she could control every detail of everyone else's life was about to learn that some things were beyond her control. No matter how many HOA meetings she organized or complaint letters she filed, the 30-day notice I would serve tomorrow wasn't just about road access rights. It was about teaching someone who'd never faced real consequences that actions have results, and that bullying people has a price that eventually comes due. Most importantly, it was about proving that her own signature had sealed her fate 20 years before she even knew my resort existed. Bev had spent months thinking she was playing chess while I was playing checkers, using her HOA presidency and community connections to outmaneuver a simple resort owner. Time to show her what a real strategic game looked like when someone who actually understood property law decided to fight back. With every legal weapon at their disposal, I hand-delivered the notice on a Tuesday morning, walking right up to Beth's pristine white door and ringing the doorbell like I was delivering a package instead of a legal document that would destroy her perfect world. 30 days to terminate vehicular access easement across my property. The letter was professional, formal, and completely emotionless, which somehow made it more terrifying than any angry confrontation could have been. Bev's initial reaction was exactly what I'd expected from someone who'd never been challenged effectively. "You can't do this," she said, standing in her pristine doorway, wearing her perfect white robe and looking like someone who'd never heard the word no in her entire life. "I'll sue you into bankruptcy. My husband is a lawyer, and we have connections throughout the county legal system." But when her husband reviewed the documents that afternoon and called their family attorney, the tune changed quickly and dramatically. The easement termination rights were legitimate, legally bulletproof, and absolutely enforceable under Colorado property law. There was no appeals process, no legal challenge they could mount, and no government agency They could pressure to override my property rights for the first time since this war began. Bev was the one scrambling for options. While I held all the power over the next 10 days, I launched my counter-campaign fake cameras along the road route, making neighbors paranoid countdown signs visible from the street emergency HOA meetings, where residents discovered their properties were at risk. Neighbors turning on each other. As the reality sank in each morning, I'd update a small sign visible from the road access termination, 17 days remaining. The sign was perfectly legal, informative rather than threatening, but it served as a daily reminder that her perfect world was about to collapse unless she found a solution to a problem she'd created herself. Mrs. Langston, who'd crossed the road to avoid me just weeks earlier, now approached with tears in her eyes. "Carter, please, we had no idea this would happen. Some of us never wanted to fight with you in the first place." Two other neighbors followed suit by day 15, completely bypassing Bev and begging for reasonable solutions that would preserve their property values. Bev hired a professional survey team to challenge my property boundaries, convinced that my easement rights couldn't possibly be as absolute as my lawyer claimed. The survey team spent 3 days with GPS equipment and historical records, only to confirm what I already knew. The main road ran directly through the center of my land, and my termination rights were unquestionable. The survey cost her $6,000 and proved that her situation was even worse than she'd initially realized. Day 20 brought the property value assessments that confirmed everyone's worst fears about the financial implications of Bev's war against my resort. Real estate agents confirmed that landlocked properties in rural Colorado typically lost 55 to 60% of their value overnight. Bev's house would drop from $750,000 to maybe $300,000, while her neighbors faced similar devastating losses. Her perfect high-end community was about to become a collection of worthless lots, accessible only by hiking trail. The HOA was fracturing from within as members realized the magnitude of the disaster their president had created through her personal obsession with eliminating my business. Why didn't anyone research property rights before declaring war on the resort? One neighbor demanded during a heated meeting. I could hear from my cabin, "We trusted you to protect our investments, not destroy them for your personal aesthetic preferences." Internal fighting replaced united opposition, and Bev's authority as HOA president was crumbling along with her credibility. Her desperate measures became increasingly pathetic and revealing of her character. When faced with actual consequences for her actions, she contacted the county about illegal road blockage, but was told that private property owners have absolute rights to control access across their land. She tried organizing a petition against me, but managed only 2 signatures from neighbors who were too polite to refuse her directly. She even attempted to recruit other contractors to block my alternate access road construction, but word had gotten around about her tactics, and no one in the construction community wanted to get involved in her personal war. By day 25, I could see the dramatic change in Bev's demeanor when she drove past my property during her daily inspections that had become increasingly frantic and purposeless. The fire was gone from her eyes, replaced by cold calculation and growing desperation as she realized that her perfect control over the community was built on land that wasn't hers to control. The woman who'd spent months making everyone else's life miserable, was finally learning what helplessness felt like. Nathan stopped by regularly during this period, partly to help with construction planning, but mostly to witness Bev's psychological unraveling, which was both fascinating and disturbing to watch. "I've never seen anything like it," he told me on day 26 while we reviewed equipment schedules. "She used to strut around like she owned the whole town and everyone in it. Now she looks like someone who's just realized she's been playing poker with a stacked deck and the other player is about to call her bluff." The countdown was psychological torture for someone like Bev, who needed to control every situation. She'd built her entire identity around being the person who made decisions for everyone else, who set the standards and enforced the rules. Now she was completely powerless, watching a clock tick down to the destruction of everything she'd tried to create. 5 days remaining before road access termination. Bev was scrambling to find any solution that didn't involve admitting she'd been wrong, apologizing for destroying my bridge, or acknowledging that her perfect community wasn't hers to control. But I hadn't revealed my ace in the hole yet, the recording device I'd set up during her negotiation visit on day 5 was about to provide the perfect ending to this psychological warfare campaign and ensure that her defeat would be complete and public. The woman who'd tried to eliminate my business through manipulation and false reports was about to learn that everything she'd said and done had been documented, and that her own words would seal her fate in front of the entire community she tried to control. Day 28. I announced that construction of my new resort access road would begin the following morning with professional crews, scheduled equipment loaded, and Nathan coordinating heavy machinery from 3 different suppliers across the county. The alternate route would be completed in 8 hours of intensive work, giving my resort permanent access that didn't depend on anyone else's property or goodwill. Bev's response was predictably desperate and legally frivolous. She filed an emergency injunction to stop my construction, claiming it would cause irreparable environmental damage to sensitive wetlands and endanger community safety through increased traffic on secondary roads. The environmental claims were fabricated. My planned route avoided all wetlands and creek areas, but she was hoping to delay the project with legal maneuvers long enough to find some other solution to her impossible situation. The court hearing was scheduled for 7 o'clock in the morning, exactly when my construction crews were supposed to start work. She thought she could delay the project indefinitely with preliminary injunctions and environmental impact studies, but the judge saw right through her desperation strategy. After reviewing the engineering reports and environmental assessments I had prepared in advance, "Ma'am," the judge said after reviewing the paperwork with obvious impatience, "this gentleman has an absolute right to build roads on his own property for accessing his legal business operations. Your HOA situation is unfortunate, but it's not grounds for preventing lawful construction on private land. That doesn't impact anyone else's property rights." Injunction denied. Construction approved. Environmental concerns dismissed as unfounded. Game over. 4. Bev's legal strategy. The construction crews arrived at 8 a.m. sharp with bulldozers, grows, and dump trucks full of gravel, and the Denver news media wasn't far behind them. Someone had tipped off reporters about the HOA versus small business story developing in Willowbrook Springs, and suddenly my property was crawling with cameras, journalists, and satellite trucks broadcasting live updates throughout the day. The narrative was perfect for media consumption. hardworking entrepreneur fighting back against overreaching homeowners association that had destroyed his business out of aesthetic snobbery. By noon, my new access road was operational and thoroughly tested with heavy vehicles. Resort guests could reach their cabins without crossing property controlled by B's HOA, and I was no longer dependent on her goodwill or subject to her harassment campaigns. The psychological reversal was complete. She needed my road access to maintain her property values and daily life, but I no longer needed her permission for anything related to my business operations. The community revolt was beautiful to watch unfold throughout the afternoon and evening. A 70-year-old neighbor named Margaret Smith showed up at the HOA meeting that evening and literally beat B's community rules sign with her walking cane while news cameras rolled and captured every moment. "You destroyed that young man's business for your personal vanity," she shouted, while other neighbors applauded. "And now you've destroyed our property values too. I've lived here longer than you, and I never agreed to let you ruin this community with your power thrift." 4 of the 8 HOA members formally demanded Bev's resignation that very night, with 3 more threatening to follow. If she didn't accept responsibility for the disaster she'd created, Bev's sabotage attempts became increasingly pathetic and desperate as she realized that her position was completely hopeless. She tried to block my construction trucks by parking her car across the work zone, which earned her a police warning for obstructing traffic and interfering with legal construction activities. She contacted environmental agencies with fabricated concerns about creek contamination and wetland destruction, but inspectors found no violations and warned her about filing false reports. She even attempted to rally public support with a roadside protest, but only managed to attract 3 supporters, while dozens of local residents showed up to counter-protest her tactics and demand her resignation. The most satisfying moment of the entire day came when County Inspector Richard Hayes quietly approached me during the construction work, looking genuinely embarrassed and concerned about his role in the bridge destruction. "I owe you a sincere apology," he said, removing his county hat and speaking quietly so the news cameras couldn't overhear. "Mrs. Ashford pressured me with incomplete and misleading information about your bridge safety. I should have conducted a more thorough investigation and required actual engineering reports before authorizing the demolition. My hasty decision cost you your business access and nearly destroyed your livelihood." His admission confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Bev had manipulated county officials with fabricated safety reports and emotional appeals about community danger. Hayes had acted in good faith based on false information, but his apology validated my position and provided additional evidence for potential legal action against Bev for filing false safety reports with government agencies. Day 29 professional barriers and gates were installed at the main road entrance with clear signage indicating private property, authorized access only, and easement terminated. No public access. The barriers were substantial steel constructions that couldn't be easily removed or bypassed, making it clear that this wasn't a temporary inconvenience, but a permanent change in access rights. Tomorrow morning, Bev's neighborhood would wake up completely cut off from vehicle access to their homes, unless they wanted to hike several miles through rough terrain. But I still had one final surprise that would ensure Bev's defeat was not only complete, but also publicly documented for everyone to understand exactly what she'd done and why she deserved the consequences during Bev's negotiation visit on day 5, when she'd tried to intimidate me into accepting her demands. I'd set up a digital recording device in my cabin, her admission that I have to get rid of this resort by any means necessary, because commercial operations don't fit my vision of community perfection, was about to become public evidence of her deliberate sabotage campaign and malicious destruction of my business. 6 o'clock a.m. Day 30, the barriers went up with mechanical precision. Professional-grade steel gates blocked vehicle access to Bev's neighborhood with clear signage indicating private property, no public access. The main road was officially closed, and 8 families woke up to discover they were completely cut off from the outside world, unless they wanted to hike several miles through rough terrain to reach alternative transportation. Bev's final desperation move was organizing an impromptu media protest designed to paint herself as the victim of a vindictive business owner who couldn't accept legitimate community concerns. She set up in front of my gates at 8 o'clock a.m. with hastily made signs claiming I was holding an entire community hostage for personal revenge. Local news crews arrived to film her tearful performance about being victimized by a man who values money more than human decency. The performance was professionally orchestrated, complete with prepared talking points about my history of ignoring safety concerns and my refusal to work with community leaders. She'd even recruited 3 neighbors to stand with her holding signs about corporate bullying and small-town values under attack. For anyone who didn't know the full story, it might have looked like a legitimate grassroots protest, but I was ready for her media manipulation. At 10 o'clock I held my own press conference on my property, complete with professional setup and chronological evidence presentation. I had copies of every complaint letter she'd sent, documentation of the fake safety reports used to justify bridge demolition, and records of the HOA's harassment campaign designed to force me out of business. The presentation was calm, factual, and devastating to Bev's credibility. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for since day 5 of the countdown. I set up a projection screen in the middle of my property and played the recording from Bev's negotiation visit, her own voice, crystal clear. I have to get rid of this resort by any means necessary. This neighborhood is supposed to be perfect, and commercial operations don't fit my vision. I don't care what your permits say or how legal your business is. It doesn't belong here, and I will do whatever it takes to remove it. The assembled crowd heard her admit to deliberate sabotage with malicious intent, confirming that the bridge destruction wasn't about safety but about personal control. The recording was damning evidence of her true motivations and her willingness to destroy other people's livelihoods to achieve her vision of perfection. The community reaction was immediate and decisive. I stepped out of that press conference to find my neighbors lining both sides of the pathway, spontaneously applauding. 7 of the 8 HOA members voted to remove Bev from the presidency. That very afternoon, an emergency community meeting was called for that evening to demand new leadership and immediate negotiations for road access restoration. My conditions for restoring road access were simple and non-negotiable. First, Bev had to resign from the HOA presidency immediately and permanently. Second, she owed me a public apology and formal admission that the bridge destruction was based on false safety reports. Third, $25,000 in compensation for business losses and bridge replacement expenses. Fourth, the new HOA leadership had to work cooperatively with me. Instead of trying to eliminate my business, the public humiliation was complete when Bev was forced to deliver her apology at a packed town meeting, standing at a podium in front of more than 100 community members and 3 news crews. She admitted that her safety concerns about my bridge had been exaggerated and that her actions had caused unintended consequences for community property values. The woman who'd spent months controlling everyone else's life was finally facing consequences for her own actions. County Inspector Richard Hayes made his own public apology, admitting that he'd authorized the bridge demolition based on incomplete information and promising more thorough investigations in the future. The county expedited funding for bridge reconstruction, using their own budget to repair the damage caused by their hasty decision-making. The business results exceeded my wildest expectations. Resort bookings surged from viral media attention and public sympathy for the small business owner who'd fought back against HOA bullying. I had a waiting list for the first time in 3 years, with customers specifically requesting stays at the resort. That beat the HOA. I rebuilt my hand-carved sign with a new addition built once, defended twice. Bridge reconstruction began within 60 days using county funding and community volunteers who wanted to help repair the damage. Bev had caused the new bridge was stronger than the original, designed to last for decades. Nathan's hardware store benefited enormously from increased community support, and he added a piece of my original resort sign to his vintage collection. The symbolic ending was captured by a drone camera that showed Bev's moving truck leaving Willowbrook Springs via the new road I'd built while I stood in the distance watching her final departure. Her property sold for 40% less than its original value, and she relocated to a different state entirely. The perfect community she'd tried to create had rejected her completely. From the increased profits of my thriving resort business, I established a small business defense fund to help other entrepreneurs facing similar HOA harassment. Nathan and I also started a community program connecting established businesses with newcomers, ensuring that future development would support rather than eliminate local enterprises. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning your own battle. It's teaching bullies that actions have consequences while proving to your community that small dreams deserve respect. 3 years ago, I built this place to escape corporate stress and create something meaningful. Turns out building something from nothing also teaches you how to defend it when others try to destroy what you've created, and sometimes defending your dream against people who want to control your life is worth more than the dream itself. The woman who thought she could eliminate my business through manipulation and false reports learned that some battles can't be won through intimidation. When you try to destroy someone's life's work for aesthetic reasons, you better make sure you understand who really holds